TU crew, welcome back. Thanks for joining us on Therapists Uncut. Nikki Young, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with my fantastic co-host Alyssa Najera, licensed clinical social worker. I feel like I'm on Price is Right now.
Spin the wheel. Anyways, back to our episode. Today, I think we're giving a shout out to all of our professionals who are working with trauma-exposed populations. But the topic that we're going to be talking about today on secondary traumatic stress could also be applicable to non-professional situations too. And I think we've got a few examples and stories to share with you today. But helping you recognize signs and symptoms of secondary traumatic stress and hopefully some tools to help you recover.
Because we're helpful here.
Or at least we think we are.
Welcome to the Therapists Uncut Podcast, where off-the-clock therapists who happen to be friends share their uncensored thoughts about real life. Join us weekly in spreading positivity and making mental health relatable through casual conversation, inspirational stories, and real talk with friends who happen to be therapists. Please welcome your co-hosts, Nikki Young and Alyssa Najera.
All right, well, before we get started, a ghost walks in to see his new therapist. And he says, I used to know who I was, but now I'm just drifting through life.
You know what I love? I love that this is always the first time I hear the joke.
Yes, because when I'm practicing my jokes, because I practice my jokes because I'm a nerd, she does this. La 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 la.
It helps be nice and fresh when we hear it on camera now.
AKA my jokes are so bad, she can only fake one laugh over them. She can't fake two in a row. So she...
Okay. You know those laughs where you laugh so hard that your stomach hurts? That was a good one.
Oh, okay. I thought she was going to be like, that was not that.
Okay, back to the episode.
Yeah.
We're talking about secondary traumatic stress today, which is not always fun. And the moments that you start experiencing these symptoms, it's not always clear and you're not always sure what's happening. So today we really want to talk about how you can recognize if you are experiencing them. And I will tell you right now, if you are in a helping profession, first responder position, in any situation or capacity where you're working with trauma-exposed populations, especially vulnerable child populations, maybe you're in law enforcement, you are at risk by default, just by being in this profession, of experiencing secondary traumatic stress. So let's talk about what it is, how you can potentially reduce the risk, and risk factors to consider. That's a lot we're going to try to put on one episode, but we're going to try. And ways that you can help mitigate those risks. All right, let's start with Nikki.
I'm Nikki. What are we starting with?
Nikkis Story.
My story. Oh, okay. So this just ties into the fact that you don't have to be in a help. I mean, we think when we in the profession think of secondary trauma, oftentimes our mind goes to a profession in which you're exposing yourself to trauma exposed individuals on the regular. And, you know, I think that the general population can obviously experience this. And I had an experience that I'm going to share that just gave me that much empathy and gratitude towards our firefighters. And yeah, this was, I don't know, 6-7 years ago. And I was on the way to Santa Cruz, going on vacation, happy place, right? Leaving work and stress behind and get away for a few days, and came around the corner and all the dust was settling, right? So it's immediately slam on the brakes, pull over, can't even see a few feet ahead of you. And as the dust settles, there's just vehicles everywhere, right? Not where they should be. Upside down. I mean, there had obviously just been a huge accident, and we were literally the first vehicle on scene. There was vehicles behind us. So immediately, pull off, jump out, run over. And, there's those of us who can recognize this quickly recognize that there's already been a lot of death. So go into immediate triage mode of where am I useful, right? I'm not going to be able to help this individually, run on to the next one. And there was, 4 or 5 of us doing that, where somebody would run up to a vehicle and kind of give you the nothing here to do. And you run on to the next one, just trying to find somebody to help. And in the course of this, encountered a vehicle where there was life and tried to help them, and ended up being with this family through the whole process, right? And come to find out, this person and people, there was a vehicle, and the driver was in our military and had come home from overseas for his wedding married his high school sweetheart, and they were driving back to the airport so he could go back to his station, and he was killed. And they had just got married the day before. And I'm sitting there holding this woman that I've never met before as she sobs and begs, us to save her husband, who was very clearly not going to make it, but you're doing what you can in that moment. And that has stuck with me all this time. And I think that I tend to have more of a first responder nature. I'm not a first responder, right? But I tend to feed off the adrenaline, do well in those crisis situations, can make those easy, quick assessments. But the story behind that one got me. Mm-hmm. And that one stuck with me on the daily for quite a while. And even now, 7 years later, when somebody asks about vicarious trauma, I, immediately go to that, to the point where I was Googling this because she shared her name and all of this just to almost kind of see what happened. She ended up losing multiple more family members in her vehicle that day. It wasn't just her new husband. There was all these funeral announcements and everything that were very easily searchable, Googleable, but just gives you so much respect for those first responders that is their job on the daily, right? Mm-hmm. How often are firefighters the first ones to arrive on scene in any kind of medical emergency like that? And that was not a one-off sad story. It happens all the time. So.
And if you listen to our episodes, Nikki's vibe, right? Nikki's got this upbeat, goofy energy and positive vibe. And you can hear the change in her voice and her tone as she's talking about this. And what I can recognize hearing Nikki retell the story is that it's still, you could feel.
Right. Yeah. As I was telling you,
back up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Feels like you're back there on the street. Right?
And did Nikki, was she a part of this? No, but was she a bystander and somebody who then was a part of kind of the after scene? Yes. So even being a bystander of something can result in these trauma responses. And that's what secondary trauma is. It's mimicking all of the trauma responses that somebody would see in post-traumatic stress disorder. And if you would like to learn more about PTSD, please go back and listen to our previous episodes.
With our interviews on that.
We do got 3 with Officer Michael Shaw. But secondary trauma is mimicking all of those symptoms and behaviors. So I'm wondering, Nikki, after you experience that, I'm going into my therapist mode and I'm trying to control it. But what was it like? Were your thoughts getting distracted? What was your thinking patterns like? What was your sleep like?
It was absolutely distraction, right? It was on my mind no matter what. I was on my way on vacation. We continued on and continued to get on this little getaway. But I was distracted the whole time, right? So I'm sure there was moments where I was not hearing what was being said or, cool, I'm on the beach in Santa Cruz. And yet I'm thinking about the highway. And that stuck with me for a while. Absolutely.
And when you say a while, is it a couple hours?
No, I would say weeks, months. And it's not something that I think of on the daily anymore. But when somebody talks about vicarious trauma or a car accident or anything along those lines, it's, that story's there.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about the symptoms, these things happen not just immediately after the event, but they kind of stay prolonged and they turn into what Nikki just described are those intrusive thoughts where I'm getting distracted and now I'm thinking about it, and very likely flashbacks of images or pieces of that experience that kind of either come and go or might come and stay. And now I'm feeling distracted because did you ever feel like you were reliving that moment for you?
No, I never had any of that. It was more just the cognitive recall. Memories.
Yeah. So the cognitive symptoms, the things that go on in your thoughts and in your head, right? One of the other pieces that could happen is feeling like you're reliving it as though you were now a part of that story and all of the emotional and somatic, we say somatic, but the physiological stuff that goes on in your body where you kind of feel like you cringe, or maybe there's that your stomach is turning. The reason that we're talking about this is because our bodies are so susceptible to experiencing this trauma and keeping it if we don't reprocess it in a healthy way. Could I have experienced that same thing with Nikki and not have any of those symptoms? Absolutely. We all have our own individualized responses. Mm-hmm. But if you recognize some of these things coming up, then you could potentially be experiencing secondary traumatic stress, which is the impaired sleep or maybe even having nightmares. It's almost and maybe I want you to think back to what was happening to you when you were listening to Nikki tell her story. Your brain almost creates this holographic image that goes along with the words that you were hearing, even though you weren't there. And now that I am saying this out loud, I want all of you to be mindful of how you were listening to the story and making sure that you were in a place that you want to traumatize anybody. Yes, please recognize if you're being triggered by this story right now. As we're recording, we are probably going to put a sensitive topic disclosure on this because I'm hoping that it's not triggering you. But recognizing in your own personal life or in your own professional capacity how you might be susceptible to some of these trauma responses and what, if anything, in your professional capacity still kind of lives with you today, even though maybe it happened, 1, 2, 3, 5 years ago.
And I want to cue in on that word susceptible because I think I'm going to make a very broad stereotype here, but a lot of times if you wind up in certain professions where you constantly come into contact with trauma, whether that be firefighter, law enforcement officer, court social worker, emergency response social worker, crisis therapist, right? I think I'm making a broad emergency room physician. I'm making a very broad stereotype here that you might hear that and think I'm not susceptible because of my personality. Maybe I wouldn't have come into this field if I were susceptible to trauma, right? And I would identify myself as one of those people. I feel like I'm a tough motherfucker, right? And I care about people, but also I'm able to. My wife always uses a phrase in her work with anxiety and trauma, observe, don't absorb. And I feel like historically that's something I'm fairly good at. But in that moment, I think there's certain situations, and it could have been for, family's very important to me. It could have been the story. Again, I think it was the story there of just this, I can't even imagine.
Right.
Right. And I think it was that knowledge. So if you hear that, I'm not susceptible, and you kind of notice that response in yourself, challenge that because we're human and every single one of us is susceptible to secondary trauma or vicarious trauma.
Mm-hmm. And you said the story. So even removing being the witness of something tragic that happened and focusing on the story, if you are constantly hearing people's, the clinical word I'm thinking of is like trauma narratives, their story of basically the bad things that they've seen or that have happened to them, those stories have the potential of being absorbed, like Nikki mentioned. And we just have to be mindful of that because if you are noticing that's happening, if you're noticing your brain is kind of focusing on this one family or this one situation that you experienced, or this one story or cluster of stories, and it's now coming into you in the sense of flashbacks, like I keep thinking about it and I keep seeing like pictures in my head, or in the form of intrusive thoughts where now I'm thinking about, gosh, what if that were me? What if it was? And what's happening to them now? And almost just being really focused on this story. I'd encourage you to take an assessment, which we can absolutely put on the website. So if you're interested in doing a self-assessment to see where you are with this topic, please go to our website, therapistuncut.com, find the show notes for this episode, and we'll put a link on there to link you up to a self-assessment.
Mm-hmm. What are we assessing for? Just so our listeners
Secondary traumatic stress.
Yeah.
Which I think sometimes can get confused with burnout. And I just want to clarify that those are two separate experiences that are happening. Could one impact the other? Yes. But burnout is something that happens over time. Secondary traumatic stress can happen on day one of your job because of something that you heard, witnessed, or read about. Mm-hmm. So just being conscious if you're in that kind of profession that is being exposed to these kinds of trauma situations, really recognizing how that's affecting you, if at all. And even outside of that, if you're in a personal situation where you are hearing, I know we often hear like, oh, my friend's my therapist, or this is like my therapy. Well, it could be a friend who is telling you their own story because you're holding that space for them because they're loading off on you. And there are parts of that story that are really sticking with you more than you expected. So just being really conscious of how we can be susceptible to that.
Absolutely. And as far as the professional realm, I'm going to use you, right? You do a lot of work with trauma when you do individual therapy. And that's...
Look how I get all uncomfortable when she's like, let's talk about you.
Her body got stiff. She kind of leaned back a little bit like, no, let's not.
Yeah. Okay, continue.
No, when you are sitting in that room one-on-one with somebody week after week working on trauma, you are, quote, susceptible to secondary trauma, right? And we're not the ones out on the front line, right? We're not the ones coming around the corner to see that car accident every time. We're not the ones, well, I know you used to be, potentially. I don't know that I know which area of CPS you actually worked in. So I don't know, but you are no longer the one removing children, right? Or placing children, but you're still hearing about all of these forms of trauma on the regular.
And here's what I will share with you guys is I didn't understand as a child welfare professional, probably around 2015. I didn't understand that those are the things that were happening to me. And I thought it was myself who couldn't deal with the work that I was doing. And me being like a perfectionist, I'm like, I could do this and I will do this. But what I started recognizing now that I can look back is that absolutely had an impact on me in my personal life, had an impact on me in my relationship with my now husband. I was staying up like all hours of the night because I couldn't sleep. And I was having dreams that maybe were not exactly about the situations, but I can tie in themes.
Yep.
Yeah, I could definitely tie in themes. Part of what I did is I worked in emergency response where you investigate. I worked with families who were getting what's called case management, so who are working on reunifying with kids. And one of the roles that I still hold dearly to my heart, but also very difficult, is I was a child sexual abuse forensic interviewer, which means I listened to a lot of stories. And now I'm like, good thing I'm back at therapy because I could feel it coming back up now. Mm-hmm. Like I could feel the emotions coming back up.
How do you not sit there in that situation? And I have also worked historically with minors in crisis. And how do you not? It's a kid.
Yes, it's vulnerable.
How do you not sit there and hear these stories day in and day out and not get affected to some degree?
Mm-hmm. And can you be very good at what you do? Absolutely. But also, again, be very conscious of what is staying with you and figuring out how to deal with that. And sometimes it might take therapy to help you reprocess some of this stuff. But I will definitely say I thought I was good. Like I've been out of child welfare for a while. And now you're looking at me.
No, I was going to challenge your use of the word good because I thought you were going to say good in that field, but you were, and I was going to challenge that because can you be damn good at it and also have a trauma response? Hell yes.
Oh yeah. I thought I was good. Like I dealt with all of my stuff as a child welfare worker. And now that I work with child welfare organizations in another capacity.
Just bringing it up in a different light.
You want to know what I did? I avoided the hell out of the research and I avoided the hell out of researching this particular area because it took me weeks to realize that I was avoiding because all that old stuff that I thought I dealt with came back up and it didn't. And now I'm back on the boat of, well, got to go back and deal with all that stuff.
And well, and we know that when we work with trauma, right? That somebody could experience a trauma, or in this case, a secondary trauma, and completely process it in that moment of time. Mm-hmm. The situation that they're in, the current life they're living, and you get to a different stage, whether it be developmental or employment, whatever it is, you get to a different stage in life, and sometimes you got to reprocess that trauma in a different way, shape, or form in order to proceed through with the healthy, right? So we know that, and yet
we say we're fine. I'm good
with that smile.
Yeah, I'm good.
I'm good.
I'm fine. It's all good. Been doing this for 20 years. Oh, but are you though? Let's just take a step back and really assess that. So we will have resources available for you on our show notes page. And I can think of one link in particular that will hook you up with a nice, good self-assessment. And then one that really focuses on trauma responses that will help you identify if you're experiencing some of these, if so, how often. And if you recognize that that self-assessment is pretty high, I would say go back to your organization to see what resources they have available for you. Potentially check out some therapists in your area or within your state. And if it's a personal experience that you realize this is coming from, I very much encourage you to check out a therapist. So that is my tip for you. Now, and literally it's all coming back for me. Dang it. I can feel it. I could feel it in my stomach and in my chest. Mm-hmm. I got so much work left to do.
I feel it in my hands. I'm all tense here. I'm getting a little sweaty.
Yes. That's how trauma lives in the body. It comes out in ways that we don't expect it to. And if we're not conscious of it, we may not attribute it to that. Yeah. We might just kind of write it off or minimize it. But really recognizing that these are the small trauma responses that might be a result of secondary traumatic stress.
Absolutely. And like I kind of alluded to, just because you're having that response does not mean you're not a good fit, does not mean you're in the wrong profession, does not mean you're in the wrong place. It could just mean you gotta deal with it, right? Otherwise, that's just going to accumulate, and it's going to affect your own personal well-being. It's going to affect your ability to do that job you're really good at. Are there certain personalities that maybe are not the best fit for certain professions? Absolutely. And sometimes you don't realize until you get into it that, I don't know that this is good for me to stay here. And that's totally fine, right? Adapt, live and adapt. But, just because you're experiencing that doesn't mean you're not in the right spot. It just means you deserve a little attention.
Need a little extra attention. Yeah.
I feel like a lot of people heard that. Like, I don't need extra attention. So.
I'm good. I'm still good. Yeah. Go to the website, take the assessment, and then decide from there what you want to do. And I want to go back to what Nikki said. What are the individual risk factors too that could increase your chances of secondary traumatic stress is if you have your own personal history of trauma in some capacity. And a good way to assess your own personal history is through the ACE questionnaire, Adverse Childhood Experiences. Did I get that correct? Yes, I always get my acronyms wrong. So you could also take the ACEs questionnaire, but I will say you could have a low to no score on that and still have a risk of experiencing these symptoms. So I think today is really about letting you know that if you're experiencing some of these symptoms, you are not the only one.
You might be, people, and we're coming to a place where we're starting to do better about this as society, but we're starting to talk more about this. And, we go to last season, Michael Shaw was so brave, law enforcement officer coming to us and saying, I want to share my story of PTSD and my journey with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so awesome to have guys like him that are willing to do that, right? Because we have to destigmatize this stuff, right? It happens to everybody. So let's fucking talk about it and stop being so weird about it.
In organizations as a whole too, if you hear that trauma-informed processes and trauma-informed culture, Nikki's right. People are going in this direction. It's an uphill battle, but we're moving in that direction. And organizations are recognizing that this is real and it's not an isolating thing. And it says nothing about you personally, about your ability to do or not do the job. Right. But it does say that we need to be prepared for this if and when it happens. And here are some resources that are available.
And I'm just looking at the future for us as clinicians. We have practices are going to be overrun and overwhelmed with trauma response after the last couple of years that we have had, right? I mean, we have the health profession that are just completely being traumatized and vicariously traumatized on repeat, day in, day out. Educators, right? I mean, we just have I see the tsunami of trauma, right? That's just engulfing society currently, and that's going to have an effect, right? So if we can put this message out there, don't fight it, don't pretend it doesn't exist. Just be aware
and be open to exploring your options. We want to thank you guys for allowing us into your lives today and helping us make mental health relatable and a part of your everyday conversation. If this episode was helpful for you, please go to our Apple Podcast, leave us a rating, wherever you get your podcasts from. Share this with somebody and help us spread the message.
Thank you for joining Therapists Uncut, a production of AMP Smart Business. To learn more about Therapists Uncut and stay up on upcoming episodes, please subscribe and follow us on social media. As a reminder, although the Therapists Uncut co-hosts are licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to substitute professional mental health counseling. If you need professional therapy, please contact your local provider or primary care provider. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Therapists Uncut.